From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's coming up. K-State's Glynn Tonsor on the cattle markets. He'll size up the current price trends. And Glynn reflects on his testimony to the Senate Agriculture Committee recently on cattle market issues. Then Glynn is joined by K-State's Jaime Luke as she'll talk about her research into the concentration of U.S. pork exports in the wake of the dramatic rise in export business with China over the last few years. Today's Kansas wheat harvest update features crop production agent Jay Wisbey of the Central Kansas Extension District. And further ahead, K-State's Charlie Lee reviews a new study of what purple martins prefer in the way of man-made housing. All that right here on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, our Tuesday edition. Thanks for being along with us. Because we were away yesterday for the Independence Day holiday, we bring you this week's cattle market segment today. And doing the honors once more, livestock economist Glynn Tonsor, K-State Research and Extension. In fact, we'll have Glynn and a guest back in the second part of today's broadcast to talk about a specific topic. But to the cattle trades, Glynn, and as price movements go, it was a rather uneventful week last week, save perhaps what was going on in the feeder cattle market.
Yeah, on balance, I would agree with that. Before we break it down, I'll say sometimes uneventful is fine, and that's basically what we had, and that's good. I think the fundamentals are just kind of firming up in the last couple of weeks here. But when we look at cash trade first, AMS called the fed cattle trade on Friday at 124, more or less flat for the week. Compare that with feeders, as you said, the Pratt market was up $8, if not $10, depending on the weight class. Two of the lots that AMS put down, I took note of, was 145 head that weighed 831, came in at 147. The heavier lot at 903 pounds came in at 152. Those certainly would be stronger compared to the week before. Drought still persists in part of the country. I'll be careful I say it, but locally things have improved. I think that's part of what's going on there. When we compare that with the board, August live cattle contract was just under 122, down about 50 cents for the week. So fed cattle just paused there. It's basically a flat week. Feeder cattle August contract was 156.5, actually down a couple bucks from prior week. So cash market was strong compared to the nearby August contract. When we round this out, what was going on in the meat market, choice cutout was $285 on Friday, down about 20 bucks from the week before. And then select came in at $264 on Friday, down 12, almost $13 from the week before. We do have higher volumes of fed cattle moving. The processing volumes remain strong. So initial estimates, including Saturday, was 623,000 head. That's down about 661 from the week before, but up notably from 581 the prior year. It feels like we have a steady footing going with processing. Best way I know to say that. It's not free. The industry still, we're not to the levels we were before 2019 because we are running at higher cost and a little bit of restrictions, but we are working our way through these fed cattle inventories, and there's reason for optimism that the quote-unquote backlog is, I think, a fair amount behind us, and we're on our way to getting more and more current. We're seeing that in the stronger live prices, so the cash prices being flat, have gained on the cutout recently. I think that's a core reason for that.
You do have some additional numbers to share from our friends at the Livestock Marketing Information Center to lend perspective on what's ahead.
Yeah, and I'll hone in here on the fed cattle side in particular, but for the third quarter here, because we're on the start of that, I think it's good and timely. They're forecast about 2.5% lower slaughter here in the third quarter than we had in 2020, corresponding with about $1.18 cash prices. Sitting here today, that would feel a little bit pessimistic. As I said, 124 is where we're at now. Looking at the fourth quarter, almost a full 4% fewer cattle slaughtered compared to 2021, and then prices coming in about 121, 122. Why am I highlighting that? The reductions in slaughter numbers are the real things I'm trying to highlight. Is we are on our pace. I think we're going to have fewer cattle going through the system as 2021 proceeds. If, and I purposely repeated that, we maintain strong beef demand as signaled by robust cutout prices, as going back to where we were a minute ago, there's certainly room for live fed cattle prices to come up with that. If we have fewer cattle coming in the system, that is where my words of caution come in, is I would like us to see a retained strong cutout price coupled with what I think are going to be lower fed cattle prices in the months ahead, which would enable those fewer head to be worth more. My best guess sitting here today is that's what we're going to see, and I hope we confirm that in the weeks ahead.
We do routinely ask you about your meat demand monitor that you maintain on a monthly basis. We're a week ahead of ourselves here because you are just rounding out those numbers for the month of June, you say.
Yeah, I am, and we're also hit by the holiday timing on approval reports and so forth is the reality of that. I have the numbers in my back pocket, but they haven't been officially approved, so I can't give specific numbers. But suffice it to say, June, and actually more broadly, the first 6 months of 2021, I can tell you meat demand has been quite robust. That is good. For listeners that are maybe new or don't regularly listen to us, go to our Ag Manager website. You can look at past monthly reports. I will also say, and this is probably 2 weeks early, is one of the things in that Meat Demand Monitor project, which is both beef and pork checkoff funded, for those who aren't familiar with it, ongoing survey effort, is we put out a report every 6 months as well as the standard short ones monthly. So now that the first 6 months of 2021 are done, in my quote-unquote spare time, I'm working on pulling together that multi-month report. That is helpful for documenting these trends. But for our listeners who may not care about geeky stuff like how we do that, the punchline is beef demand has been quite strong via all market channels, and it is a core reason we've had higher cutout prices, and I think it's a core reason we've had improvement in fed cattle prices in recent weeks as well.
Looking forward to those numbers and reaffirming the good news on beef demand for sure. Glynn, we definitely want to acknowledge that you were invited to present testimony at a special hearing of the Senate Agriculture Committee several days ago now, and you were invited to talk about, well, the cattle markets, and that whole hearing was wrapping around a number of issues within the structure and function of the markets, and you had some rather direct things to say about where we're at and what changes might be made. You might capsulize those.
Yeah, for those that aren't familiar with this, I would encourage them, if you have an interest, if you're in the cattle industry, have an interest in the topic of pricing, how markets work, and the like, I would encourage you to watch the full session. So you can get that on C-SPAN. It's cross-linked all over Twitter. You can get to that fairly easily. It was on June 23rd if you just Google Senate Ag Committee. For today's purposes, what I'd like to highlight is anytime you have a discussion on a complicated topic in an industry the size that's as diverse as the U.S. beef cattle industry, it should not be surprising that there's some pretty strongly held and diverse views, and at times they're directly in contrast with each other. And I think that's okay. We can agree to disagree. When you have an industry this size, you're going to have different players in different positions that have different economic things at stake, and you're going to have those that just view the world differently. That's okay. For our purposes today, that's the main point I want to get across. Most of the comments I've received since that hearing have been supportive. Not all, right? Not everybody agrees with what I was sharing, but I hope all listeners know what I was sharing was honestly, in my best opinion, what's been going on, what kind of the raw data and economic logic, what not just myself, but lots of my peers have published on the topic. Important in that as well is sometimes there's a need for improvement. Sometimes we can improve things and it doesn't think it's going to have a big negative impact. It's easier for economists like me to support that if there's a very good chance it's going to improve something without obvious adverse impact. Some of those things were talked about at the hearing. Other times, economists like myself in particular, so this is just Tonsor here for a moment, get concerned about unintended consequences or what else we might do to the base underworkings of the industry that may not be the intended effect, but could easily be the unintended effect. So for the listeners that maybe saw the hearing, and now they're hearing me say this, or those that go hear it for the first time, some of my caution, and I shared a lot of words of caution, was largely about the unintended consequences of how you could change how markets work, what incentives different players have at play there. I try to hone in on, when I give talks around the world, the U.S. beef cattle industry to date has a comparative advantage in grain-finished, high-quality production. I get very concerned when we start proposing things that potentially will erode that over time, and I felt it was my job to share those views.
Among those views, and you've said this before, you've been an advocate for sustaining opportunity for producers to respond to market signals in their marketing arrangements and their production practices that meet those arrangements.
Very much so. And you could generalize that not just arrangements specific to alternative marketing agreements, which is what we were talking about there, but more generally, lots of our society, this is broader than the beef cattle industry for a moment, has thrived by evolving over time and having economic signals in the form of markets that get somebody to produce something differently or more efficiently than was done in the past because a consumer somewhere in the system says they want it. That certainly holds to beef, right? We have a lot more types of beef, items being sold through those three market channels, export, domestic, food service, domestic retail, where the ask behind those products is very different than it was 20 or 30 years ago. to paraphrase, it's hard to meet those growing demands, and most of those demands are opportunities. They align with protein demand growth, which is good, but sometimes they require doing something a little different than we did 20 or 30 years ago. And you may actually raise the cattle the same, but you got to convey information with that. Or you may have to raise the cattle differently, or provide them on a specific day to meet the specs and so forth. That is harder to do in a spot negotiated arena. I'm not going to tell you it's impossible to do, and there is a place for spot negotiated, but we need to recognize a lot of the demand growth has happened that doesn't align well with traditional live negotiated activity. Therein lies the core rub in the industry, is a lot of the economic opportunity has pivoted away from that, yet a lot of pricing to date has relied on spot negotiated. That isn't anything new. Most of our listeners are well aware of that. My job was to remind us part of why that evolution has happened, and let's be careful not to lose too much of the economic gain that has occurred with that in all the different proposals that are afoot.
All right. Before we take a break here, your thoughts on the cattle trades in this holiday abbreviated trading week?
So, yes, it is holiday abbreviated. I think on the feeder cattle side, the topic of drought has not gone nationally, but here where we reside, it's gotten better. That is supportive. At the same time, we certainly need to watch the corn market. We had a spike in the corn market this past week. The volatility in that space is not gone, but I think a lot of the shocks to the system, so to speak, are still on the feeder cattle side of things. I think we're sort of getting a steady flow and used to heavy fed cattle volumes, and we're getting more current. So I think the action in the market is going to be on the feeder cattle side in the next few days.
Very well. Well, Glynn, if you'd hold on for a moment, we'll be back with you and the guest that you'll usher in just a second here. We're going to discuss the recent research work that you and she have been collaborating on. Glynn Tonsor with us, livestock economist, K-State Research and Extension, with this week's observations on the cattle markets. Glynn returns with us shortly after these moments away. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Welcome back. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Once more along with us is K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. And moving past the cattle market commentary that Glynn provided today, want to talk a bit about the pork side of the ledger and some interesting new work that Glynn has been involved with along with his special guest. She is Jaime Luke, a PhD student here at Kansas State University in agricultural economics. And what the two of you have been looking at here, and in fact to put a fact sheet out on Glynn, the concentration in U.S. pork export business. Why this topic?
Yeah, so I'll set the stage for our discussion here today. I've said this before, and it's important to remember, our meat products, and we're going to talk pork for the next few minutes, they find the market that's available to them that's most valuable. And the market here would be either a domestic retail, domestic food service, or export. And the pork industry in particular has had a lot of growth in exports over the last couple of decades. And with that, lots of economic questions. Overall, my general take is when we get products where they're most valuable, that raises the value of the carcass, which ultimately raises the value of hogs. So understanding that and helping develop that economic growth is really important. And periodically, academics like us have to pause and hopefully do valuable research to document that and understand it. And that's what we've been doing. And I'll let Jaime describe a little more narrowly the specifics. But big picture, it's helping understand what products are going where and the economic importance of that is, so we ultimately have higher hog prices.
Jaime, bring you in, and this is a specific interest of yours, right?
It is, yeah. So recently finished up my work, my master's work at the University of Missouri, and kind of looked into different markets for different pork products across not just the U.S., but also internationally. And so kind of understanding where it is that we plug some of these products that may not be demanded by U.S. consumers on the international markets. So, yeah, kind of fun to be able to continue on that work and really dive a little bit deeper in.
And the centerpiece here, and anybody who's tracked the pork sector for any length of time knows this already, is our pork export business with China, right?
Right. Yeah. So especially over these past couple years with African swine fever in the country, kind of decimating their herd and having to rebuild, they've really had to look outside of their borders to find pork in order to feed their consumers. And so, yeah, the U.S. has really been able to step up and kind of fill some gaps for them with our exports to them here over the past couple years.
And you have some specific numbers to that effect in your write-up here. You might share those.
Yeah, so in 2020, China imported 2.2 billion pounds of U.S. pork. And that's about a third of everything we exported last year. So just taking a lot of our pork right now, just a very important market for us.
And that growth in that business has been remarkable. It's happened largely over the last, 2 or 3 years?
Right, yeah. So 2019 was a record-setting year, and then 2020 was as well. Well,
the overall, as you put it in the paper, pork export portfolio and where our pork business goes, you put an economic model to this and tried to sort all of this out.
Yeah, so we put together, it's called a Herfindahl-Hirschman index. And a lot of times this index is used when we think about like mergers and acquisitions within industries. But we kind of flipped it into the export side of things. So where it is we're sending things and what the shares of what countries are getting our pork products. And so the closer this index is to 1, the more concentrated our exports are to one country. Conversely, the closer it is to 0, the more diversified we are and the more countries that are taking various shares of our pork exports. And so what we found was that compared to, maybe back in the 80s and 90s, when that number was 0.3 to 0.4, right now, even with this increase in pork export share to China, we're still much more diverse than what we were back in those decades, the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s.
That's really interesting. That's the nugget here from your work, that it would seem on the surface that, yes, our exports of pork are highly concentrated with all the business to China. There are apparently other players in the mix now.
Right. Yeah. So, over even just the past decade, we've seen a lot of increased exports to, of course, Mexico and China, but also other Asian countries, so Japan, South Korea, and even Central America has really grown in those countries down there, as well as the Dominican Republic. So, yeah, just a lot of diversification as far as where we're shipping our U.S. pork.
Part of the equation here is what China actually imports in the way of pork cuts. That has a lot to say about the conclusion you came up with here. You might talk about that, Jaime.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people can be kind of confused when it comes to, we import pork, but we also export pork. What's that all about? Right. And I think a lot of times we forget that, pork is made up of all these different cuts of pork. Pork is not just pork. And so if we dive down and kind of look at some of the different cuts that maybe U.S. consumers aren't as interested in eating, but international consumers are, you'll see that a lot of what we ship abroad is in the form of variety meats. So think from a hog carcass like the feet or the head meat or the hearts, things that you may not find in a grocery store or on a menu in the U.S. Those things are actually highly demanded in some other countries. And so China has been a very key player in taking some of those products, purchasing those, and really helping to develop and enhance the pork cutout value here in the U.S.
And when we talk about these variety cuts, you look at the numbers, they jump off the page as to the magnitude of business here.
Right, yeah. So, last year, the U.S. exported over 1 billion pounds of variety cuts, and over half of those went to China. And if you break that down further into some specific cuts, head meat, for example, 98% of pork head meat that we exported last year went to China. So just a very commanding share. Also, if you look at feet, over 80% of pork feet went to China and over 70% of hearts. So just very important market as far as taking our variety meats.
And as far as the value of those exports, that number is multiple hundreds of millions.
Right. Yeah. And it's something we don't really think about here in the U.S., all the value that is created in those cuts that, a lot of American consumers have never thought about eating.
So it comes back to this concentration question. What do your findings tell you, Jaime, about the present and future concentration? It sounds as if there's diversity in the market more so than folks think. Where does this information help down the road?
Yeah, so, I think a lot of pork producers are kind of interested in thinking about, once China does get their herd rebuilt completely, where does all that pork go? And so knowing that we do have other consumers internationally who can take some of that, hopefully, and, build up those markets is, I think, something that's probably a positive thing for pork producers to hear.
And in that, coming back to the varietal meat orientation of our sales there, that is a market that will likely remain stable for us, perhaps, even if their African swine fever problems are cleared up?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully so. Just, finding locations, especially in Asia, for those products is super important. And so hopefully China will continue to play a big role in that.
What does this all say to you, Glynn, from the macro view as far as the pork industry, our meat exports overall? For that
yes. So remember my introductory setting the stage comment was products finding the most valuable available market. It's that simple. Now, it's really complicated when you dive into the data and the details, but over time, this industry has become more diverse and has more customers. The big value in that is we being the pork industry in that statement, less sensitive to any one exchange rate or any one relationship or trade policy or tweet or whatever it might be that would add uncertainty between country A and the U.S. doing business. Those are still costly developments, but they're not nearly as costly if you've got a wider portfolio of customers. So the risk that comes from export market exposure is lower because we have a diverse set of customers, is the way I describe that, and that is very healthy. But that statement is an aggregate one for pork and for hog producers. When you go deeper, and what the more intriguing part of what Jamie's done here and documented is individual products are actually quite concentrated. So head meat, heart, and so forth, as Jamie mapped out, are historically very reliant on China. So part of markets working is letting in collection, finding their most valuable home. We may see a big swing in, for example, head meat prices if we lost business with China, but we wouldn't see nearly the same magnitude of impact on the carcass level of the whole hog because there's some natural hedging that's occurring by these different products off the same barrel and gill going to different markets. That's really important to note. That's where some of our meat science colleagues and the like come into play. But it really goes back to not all pork is pork, right? There's a reason we import things differently we export, and we don't send things in equal proportions to different countries around the world. A lot of Jamie's work just reinforces that in several ways.
So, Jamie, you're going to be here at K-State for a while. You want to take off in added directions on this topic. What's your research plan here?
Yeah, so I really do enjoy the international marketing side of things. Having grown up on a farm, I always found it fascinating that products that my family were producing would end up in, maybe a grocery store in China or something along those lines. So, yeah, hopefully we'll be able to dive further into international meat trade here in the coming years.
Well, this initial work is rather enlightening considering our perceptions of pork exports and how much we've been selling to, in particular, China, and the fact that there are other players out there and that we're not so fully beholding on that country to move pork in international channels. So appreciate you coming over. Thanks for the information, and we'll talk again soon, both of you.
Thanks for having us on, Eric.
Along with K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor, a graduate student who will be conducting research in concert with Glynn here at the university. Jaime Luke is her name. Once more, they've put together a fact sheet on concentration of U.S. pork exports, and it can be found as we speak on the agmanager.info website. So take a look at that at agmanager.info. You are tuned in to Agriculture Today. After the break, today's Kansas wheat harvest update for you and more here on the K-State Radio Network. Welcome back. You're tuned to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. For you now, another Kansas wheat harvest update, and this time we'll settle in on the central part of the state, and more directly the Central Kansas Extension District, making that up Saline and Ottawa counties. We are visiting with the crop production agent assigned to that district, Jay Wisbey. Jay, you've had some accommodating weather of late, have you not, to push your harvest along?
Yeah, finally. Our harvest took off and really had a couple days of decent run, and then it was really held up by the weather, some rain, and over this holiday weekend we really got to rolling. So I think farmers have been thankful for the weather as of late, for sure.
As you can read it to the moment, what level of progress are you seeing? Is it half cut? Is it more than that? What?
Actually, I think we're starting to see people finish up. So I would say 80+% finishing now. We're getting some people reaching the ending line.
Before the combines rolled, what was the general thinking on the state of wheat in those two counties? What was the general assessment going in?
Yeah, we've got a lot of variability. Last fall it was so dry when we planted it, so we had The wheat that went in early was pretty good, and we were not too sure about the stuff that didn't come up well into the fall. And it's kind of held true, I would say.
And talk about that and what sort of numbers you were hearing from your producers, from your delivery points as well, as far as yields and test weights, and how that planting date factored in.
Yeah, we've had extreme variability, I would say. I've heard some really low numbers, as low as 10 to 20, and, I think there was some flood damage there. It's clear up to the 80s to almost maybe 90 in some irrigated wheat. So we've had extreme variability depending on plantings, there's been disease pressure at times and some other factors as well. We had a little more wheat streak mosaic in our area than I would have liked to have seen for sure. Well, any's more I'd like to see. We had some flooding from that big weather event prior to harvest that held some of the low-lying fields that don't drain so well. That hurt. And then just rust overall and just normal disease pressure. We had a lot of disease pressure this year.
That waterlogging that was reported in that region around Salina, that was pretty severe, wasn't it?
Yeah. We have some pretty flat fields on this bottom, and the water doesn't get away so fast, and it just happened at the wrong time based on our growth. And just prior to harvest, pretty much wheat perished too early for sure.
Test weights, though, have they held up reasonably well given all?
We've had pretty big variability along that as well.
Mm-hmm.
I would say anywhere from mid-50s up to 63, I guess, hits most of our test weights. This last rain event have brought down a couple points, so it's not finding anything in the 60s now would be hard to find, I'm sure, but we started there for sure.
It wasn't ideal for all of your producers. It's still been a relatively good crop for some. What's your producers' general attitude out there right now about their wheat cropping, given the variability that you talked about, plus the fact that the market's doing well?
Yeah, the markets have really got us pretty optimistic on that side of things. We've had some pretty good yields. They haven't been all bad, so people are pretty excited. There's been quite a bit of double crop beans going in now as well, so we're trying to take advantage of more markets going forward. So, I think overall it's been a decent harvest. It's just drug out way longer than what we're used to.
Even at this relatively late date, you have producers following along with the planter and putting in beans and maybe grain sorghum too?
Yeah, we do. I've seen several planters out this morning on my way to work, in fact. So it's a little later than we would have ideally liked, but they're still trying to catch that market for sure.
So if all goes well, could your producers in Ottawa and Saline counties be tying things off before week's end?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, a few more days and harvest will be pretty well finished in our area.
Jay, thanks for letting us know how things are going in that area. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Eric.
Jay Wisbey is the crop production agent for the Central Kansas Extension District, that is Saline and Ottawa counties. Our wheat harvest update for today. Next up for you is this week's edition of Milk Lines with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning what we can do when we're undergoing severe heat stress and maybe we don't have all the heat abatement installed that we really need to keep our cows cool. As you look at your animals maybe this afternoon and you think about how heavy they're breathing, you might be wondering, what could I do kind of just temporarily, maybe to try to get through the next few days until we get to maybe some cooler weather. So first things first. Number one, make sure you have plenty of drinking water available to the animals. And one of the first things we need to think about is space at the water trough. Are your animals standing in line waiting to get a drink? Well, if that's the case, do you have the ability to put in some temporary water troughs? And again, these would be water troughs that may not be used for a long period during the summer, but just when we undergo these types of severe heat stress. So water hoses and temporary troughs are a way to give some additional drinking space, and even if you have to refill them a few times a day, it still allows our animals to do a better job of managing the heat stress. Second thing to think about, in the afternoon when it's really, really hot and the animals are really suffering, do you have the ability to spray some water on their backs? That could be with a garden hose, using just a handheld nozzle. It could be a lawn sprinkler that you set up to spray over the animals. Here's the key. If you set up a lawn sprinkler, you just don't want it to run continuous. You'd like it to come on for a bit and then shut off. Generally, if you start to see water running off the backs of the animal, that means you could shut it off. That's one wetting cycle. And then allow the animals to dry, maybe 30 minutes or so, and then another shot of water on their backs. Do that several times during the afternoon. Excellent way to help them survive the severe heat stress. One of the primary places you need to probably look at doing that is your holding pen of your milking parlor, particularly if you're milking in the late afternoon, early evening when it's extremely hot. And you might want to think about your dry cows and your pre-fresh animals, as well as your calves, as you think about what you might be needing to do on a temporary basis just to help them through a situation where we have severe heat stress for several days. You'd like to have all the permanent stuff installed, but if you don't, there are many things that you can do to help your animals survive some of the intermittent heat stress that we will experience during the summer this year. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And you're listening to Agriculture Today. This Agriculture Today closes out with former K-State Research and Extension wildlife specialist Charlie Lee. He's along each week to talk wildlife management with us. Charlie, you have in hand this time around a new study on purple martin housing. This is a bird that many folks have attempted to attract over the years, and for good reasons.
Yes, the purple martin's a cavity nesting bird. That's North America's largest swallow. The indigenous people learned by hanging artificial nest structures around their camps that they could see some benefits from the birds consuming insects. Purple martins don't feed on a very high percentage of mosquitoes, but many of the other flying insects are consumed by purple martins, and thus people have been trying to attract them to their locations for many years. The populations of purple martins are in decline. It's a fairly slow decline, but they are declining. There is some concern about this decline since they rely on human-made nesting structures almost exclusively. Originally, there was plenty of natural cavities that they could use for nesting, but because of the increased numbers of European starlings and house sparrows that seem to outcompete them for those nest structures, they're forced to seek human-made housing. And one of the problems with providing human-made housing is to get people interested in purple martins so that they have enough interest and enthusiasm to put up this type of housing. And when people use and install purple martin housing and fail to get some success with purple martins nesting there, they soon become disillusioned and the houses become in disrepair.
Well, that gave rise to this research. It took place in Canada, you tell us, on purple martin housing preferences. Was that the drift of it?
Yeah, their goal was to determine those nest house characteristics, such as the location and the physical characteristics of the nest, that led to greater nest house occupancy by purple martins. The study was conducted from 2006 to 2018 in central Alberta. So this would be towards the northern part of purple martin range. Each June during that time frame, they kept track of the number of purple martin pairs that were present at each house. They had 86 houses that they observed during that time frame on a regular basis. They surveyed each houses for 10 minutes, recording the number of pairs of purple martins that were present in or around each nest box, and then they collected the data that was surrounding those nest boxes to help them come up with some conclusions.
And the observations they made, you think, could well be of benefit in as far as creating and maintaining purple martin housing?
Yes, I think people get frustrated very quickly if they don't have success, whether it's in purple martin housing or some other endeavor. And this would show, at least scientifically, support some of the techniques that are going to lead to be more successful in getting purple martins to utilize nest houses that you put up. When they looked at the data, they found that using 3 different models to determine purple martin occupancy, they found that those houses that were on city-owned land that were specifically of the North Star purple martin design with white exteriors, semicircular openings, and had vertical accessibility, meaning could be lowered to the ground for maintenance, and had no shrubs at the base, seemed to be those that were occupied most frequently. The occupancy also increased for houses that were higher, that were closer to the water, and further from trees and human buildings. Purple martin occupancy was higher for houses that were from 5 to 20 meters from neighboring purple martin houses. So that is somewhat different than some of the other information that's been published by various conservation organizations, but this seems to be a fairly consistent approach using a scientific methodology to try to come up with the characteristics that purple martins seem to find most useful to them.
The common thread there appears to be that purple martins prefer their isolation and away from potential threats.
Well, that's somewhat true for nest boxes, but they do congregate in higher numbers. It's just the density that they will tolerate. And it seems that if you spread them out just a little bit, keep them up in the air, have the right nest box design, you can be much more successful. And purple martin landlords that can build and manage them with the right characteristics are going to see increased nesting occupancy.
So where does one go, and you described what the study suggested on housing design, where does one go to get a blueprint, if you will?
There are numerous websites that provide information on nest box design. You can purchase the North Star houses online. There are conservation organizations that specialize in purple martins. They have a great website. You can get information from that website. So there's a lot of information out there. Just utilize some of the existing information, modify your houses and the locations you install those houses with this type of information, and you can see a dramatic increase in success.
And with that commitment to maintaining those houses as well.
Yes, remember that was one of the keys. The houses need to be able to be dropped down, so preferably in a horizontal manner. There is some problems with dropping houses down that are on a teeter-totter style, in that you can break some eggs, disrupt the nest. So if they're lowered vertically, again, that is a key to increasing the nesting occupancy rates.
Well, good information resulting from this research out of Canada. Once more, they observed 86 purple martin houses to find out what the birds truly prefer in the way of housing structure and location. Charlie, thanks for going over that with us. Longtime wildlife specialist Charlie Lee of K-State Research and Extension. That is our time for today. On tomorrow's broadcast, we'll welcome in K-State's Robin Reed. Robin covers the freshly updated estimates on USDA crop program payments under the Ark County option. On 2020 production, those will be coming out in early fall. And we'll have much more for you right here tomorrow. Please rejoin us then. Meantime, Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.